Welcome everyone to our second IGRC 2024 webinar. Very happy to be here. My name is Julie Gaudreau. I'm the Executive Director of the International Gas Research Conference that will be held in Banff in May 2024. Last year, the Canadian Gas Association was selected to host the conference by the International Gas Union, which is the industry association which represents the global gas value chain. We're very proud to host the world's largest conference on gas innovation. And we want to showcase all the innovations that are being done here in Canada, but also around the globe. And our plan is to have over the next 2 years a series of activities and an ongoing conversation around innovation to build a momentum that will lead us to the conference. We invite you to visit our website at igrc2024.org to stay informed of upcoming activities. Businesses in the Canadian natural gas value chain industry have had a long history of engagement with Indigenous peoples, with an increasing focus on strong relationships and shared benefits. Indigenous participation in the industry has expanded to include a range of partnerships between proponents and communities, ranging from benefit agreements to training and procurement, environmental monitoring, and increasingly equity ownership. This truly represents social innovation in the way industry and communities work together and has the potential to uniquely position the Canadian natural gas in the world. So during this session, you will hear from two Indigenous leaders at the leading edge of involvement in natural gas development. They will highlight their groundbreaking work and how it is transforming projects and the role that Canada as an energy exporter can play to enable global energy security, global emission reductions, while advancing reconciliation and the prosperity of Indigenous communities. A few things about the logistics. Your microphone will be muted for the duration of the panelists and moderators exchanges. So if you have any questions for the panelists, you can type them into the chat and we'll be able to address them during the Q&As. Now, let me introduce you to our moderator, Shannon Joseph. She is the Vice President of External Relations and Indigenous Affairs at Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. I will let her introduce our two Indigenous leaders who will participate to the discussion. Please note that Chief Counselor Crystal Smith, who was supposed to take part in the conversation, will not be able to participate in our webinar due to a last-minute scheduling conflict. Shannon, without further delay, I give you the floor and I wish you all an excellent discussion.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks everyone for being part of this conversation. This is really exciting and timely, just a few days after National Indigenous Peoples Day, to have this conversation around how social innovation through collaboration between industry and Indigenous peoples are really transforming and creating new potential for Canadian natural gas, Canadian LNG. And so our two panelists today are Karen Oguntays. Karen is the CEO of the First Nations LNG Alliance, a society of First Nations in support of responsible LNG development in BC, with a focus on environment, on First Nations consultation and engagement. Karen brings extensive experience, having served as chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation for 6 years, and she's currently a council member for the nation, holding the natural resource, energy, and economic portfolios. Our other panelist, Chris Sankey, is a senior partner at Nation Origination Ventures Group, Inc., a company that specializes in energy and food security. He's principal owner and president of Blackfish Enterprises, a company that provides strategic advice, direction, and planning to Indigenous communities and industry stakeholders both domestically and internationally. Chris is also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he provides advice on Indigenous affairs, research, and policy work. Both of these leaders I've worked with quite a bit in my time. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And to kick things off, I wanted to put out the question, what is social innovation? What does it mean for Indigenous people and natural gas development in Canada? And maybe we can start with Karen.
Well, social innovation and what it means for Indigenous people and natural gas development in Canada. Well, I really believe that we have to continue to do projects in a responsible and sustainable way, which I think, is happening with some of the projects that are on their way, with like the Coastal GasLink and TransCanada Energy. And I think that we've seen so many economic benefits coming back to our nation. In particular, one of the 20 First Nations that have signed on to the Coastal GasLink project. And I think that when we signed on to this project, that was one of the, few of the aspects that we made sure that we covered. And one, first and foremost, was ensuring that we continuously have the highest environmental standards. Being stewards of the land, that was one of the key critical aspects that we made sure, the box was checked in that regard. And I think that, having support from the community members was another important aspect of the project, ensuring that we're doing our due diligence, informing our communities on what the project is and what it isn't. And I think that there's win-wins across the board. And I think the one key message that I find that's still relevant today is that, especially from the Glasgow outcomes, we still continue to want to support Asia coming off of coal, because when we can do that, we're reducing the greenhouse gas emissions globally at a higher rate. So I think those are some of the critical components, I think, in order to get a good project happening. And I can touch on economic reconciliation, because I think that's probably another key aspect. I think that most people know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 92 calls to action. I think that, the findings of the 215 children really bring that to the forefront. It makes, our history more real than it ever was. And I think we've come past that 1 year mark already. And I think that the eyes of Canada are open. And I think that it advances economic reconciliation even more for Indigenous people. And I think there's other aspects to equity ownership, but I'll save some space here for Chris to speak as well on this topic. Ms.
All right, thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Karen. It's very insightful. Social innovation is about the participation of Indigenous leaders and communities where we're allowed to express our culture and our language and our arts as who we are as a people. I always tell people we've been in business for 10,000 years. Since before contact, where we bartered and trade, which back then we called grease trails, which today Canada calls rail lines, highways, and waterways. And so social innovation is about, for myself and the work that I'm doing around the Tsimshian Roundtable, is have a collective of minds of Indigenous leaders, both hereditary and elected, sit down to look at traditional knowledge, common interests, political risk, and a path forward, and how best how best we could work together as a nation, but not only as a nation, but be able to work with our neighbors, whether it be Haida or the Nisga'a or the Wet'suwet'en or Treaty 8 BC. In Northeast BC, and then so forth, when we look at trying to invite other communities from Treaty 8 Alberta to come break bread with the coastal communities, because I found in all of my travels that there was not a lot of difference in terms of discussion. All the leaders and the community members, right down to the children, want to grow the economy, but protect the environment as best we can. historically, Indigenous people only took what they needed and left the rest to Mother Nature, and to make sure that the next generation or the next seasons that we have plentiful or bountiful amount of food to provide for the next 7 generations. So with this opportunity to sit down with the leaders, we also now look at can we break the cycle of poverty, and through social innovation, we'll get the opportunity to manage intergenerational wealth for the next 7 generations. And we already see that happening, where our members are buying homes and getting a mortgage for the first time, and buying cars and going on trips that many of us only ever dreamt about when we were kids. And it's so great to see. And a lot of these are friends of mine that I know personally, and to hear what they're doing with their lives is very exciting. And I look forward for the next 10, 20, 30 years of the way the nations could work together.
Thanks, Chris. And you kind of started getting into my second question, which was, tell us about some of the projects you've been involved in where we're really starting to see this social innovation at work. And I know, like, in the preparation for this, I was really excited to talk a little bit about this Tsimshian leadership table that you mentioned. Can you tell folks more about why this is an important example, and what it can mean if other communities are able to do what you've done? What have you done here, and why is it important?
Well, first, it's to show and demonstrate to industry in Canada that as a nation we could work together despite our differences and challenges we may have internally. But second, the more important one I find is that if you could get a collective of Indigenous leaders at the table, of like-minded, and have the same vision, what you are really doing is de-risking the potential proposed projects for the future when industry comes to the table. I always say the leaders are creating a landing strip for industry to come to the table with open arms, so long as our culture and our language as who we are as a people is first and foremost. As Karen alluded to, a lot of our historical engagements with our neighbors and internally was always based on our cultural protocol, and it's going to be like that moving forward. And I think it's very exciting because it brings a whole different dynamic to industry. So when you combine our table with new technology and social innovation and innovation in itself, I really believe like we could create a phenomenal outlook for Canada's natural resource sector as we move forward into the future.
That is really exciting, and I think that lays the foundation for a lot of the work that members of Karen's organization have been involved with. Karen, a lot of your members have been involved very deeply in LNG Canada. They're very involved in Cedar LNG. You mentioned the equity stake in Coastal GasLink. Can you tell our listeners about these projects? What makes them special? How they were able to come together in a way that, as Chris, says, really speaks to and it respects and integrates values, Indigenous values.
Okay, first, before I forget, I wanted to do this, but I just rushed through it. I wanted to do a land acknowledgement and thank Stolo Nation for allowing me to conduct my business on their territory. I think that's really important. And that's one of the pieces of reconciliation, is ensuring that we do that. I think that just to go back a little bit in terms of just to touch on some of the items that Chris talked about the principles coming from an Indigenous perspective, which are really, I think, make the difference for Indigenous people. And those values come from who we are as Wet'suwet'en, who we are as Tsimshian people. I think some of the principles that we really rely heavily on is the principle of sharing. We make sure that no one gets left behind, that the wealth is shared amongst the community, the families and communities and the people that are in our clan houses. And I think that's important. And it's the same principle as giving. We continuously to give, and that's one of the acts that we do in the feast halls. And I can't emphasize the whole principle of respect. In our language, it's wagoose, and I think we want to, have respect for all things, all living things, and I think those respect for one another respect for each other's differences that we see. Sometimes we don't always agree, and it's a matter of respecting people's where they come from and why, whatever choices that they make. So I think those are important principles that make it different from projects that we see based on capitalism. And I think that's the difference we want to sort of make in relation to Indigenous communities. And just to go answer your question in relation to the projects that we've seen, our nation has never been part of a major project, even though we've had some go through our communities and territories. And I think that's really, I think that all of the 21st Nations are making history, at least for our communities that haven't dealt with oil and gas at all in our communities. And I think it's in exciting times, even though we've gone through the pandemic and those hard times. But I think that some of the highlights from the Coastal GasLink project is the 10% equity stake that each of our communities has the opportunity to buy into. And I think we're thinking long term. People may see this project as short term with short term employment, but there's long term benefits. Long term benefits for our community. That's sort of what we're seeing as well. And I think it's too bad Crystal couldn't be here so she could speak to Cedar and to LNG that's happening right in Kitimat, because that's Haisla's story to tell. And I think there's exciting times, especially for Haisla. There's a lot of light given to Cedar LNG, which is really one of the highlights of this project with CGL. I think the other opportunities that we've seen were the procurement opportunities that all of the 21st Nations have had the same opportunity to apply for other procurement opportunities in terms of camps and catering, security, clearing, and there have been other procurement opportunities that our nations have seen, which we have never seen before. And I think for our nation, we've really did our best to ensure that our nation is participatory in this pipeline, and making sure that at the end of the day, benefits are going back to the people. And I think that's really important. And for our community, we developed a 5-pillar system: governance, language and culture, health and wellness, education and training, and housing. So those are sort of our immediate needs, and that are continuous, whether we have major projects or not. Those issues within our community, we as leadership continue to have to deal with those. So I think it's hitting those targets and making sure that each of those pillars are being addressed and in a meaningful way, so that it's going back to the community.
That's really powerful, Karen. And Chris, I'm wondering in the context of your coastal project, if you've started to identify, or if that table has started to identify those types of priorities for themselves, and what will be important to them in coming together and supporting a project.
Whatever the first of all, I too want to acknowledge the lands that we're on of the Coast Tsimshian, which is Lakakwa lands in Metlakatla. So I thank them for allowing me to do business in the territory. Look, we have an opportunity where they're going to look at tourism, they're going to look at energy, they're going to look at land development, whatever the leaders decide to choose to work together on will be a testament of that, whether they could do it or not. And they always talk about that. Let's start with one thing and let the dominoes fall. And I always say that once you're able to establish one good business where you're able to work together, I always say the leaders have an opportunity to look at think globally and act locally. And so there's talks around energy, there's talks around forestry, there's talks around fisheries, there's talks around oil and gas. But at the end of the day, ultimately, it's up to the leaders to decide how best they're going to move forward. One of the things that I am super excited about is this November is we're going to host the All Tsimshian Leadership Gathering. It'll be an exciting time. I really believe the leaders are going in the right direction to demonstrate to our membership that they could work together. And it's going to happen in Prince Rupert, and it's a very exciting time. When you think about reconciliation, I always say that there's no better way to start than reconciling with ourselves. We not only have to reconcile with government and industry, but I think more importantly, we have to reconcile with each other in order to move forward. And it goes back to that same old adage that you need to have solid foundation before you start to build your home. And if you have a cracked foundation, as you know, many things could go wrong. And so that's what they don't want to happen moving forward. So that's why I always say that before other nations have the opportunity to meet with us, we want to make sure the Tsimshian has strength under their legs and that they're working collaboratively, and that if any challenges may come and face, which they will, they would have addressed those already. So it's exciting for us. It's never been done. You know, I know when I took it on, when I first approached one of the communities, people thought I was crazy. They said that they didn't think I was going to get it done. And, you know, the leaders are the ones who got it done. They came together and signed a protocol agreement, and that solidifies and kind of it holds them to account as well to make sure that they're going to stick to their goal and work together. Because I always say together we're stronger.
Thank you for that, and I think that's an important message, and I'm speaking to you all from Algonquin territory here in Ontario, and really honored to be able to be part of this conversation and working from here as well. I wanted to, I guess, move from this is all really important and powerful work that you're doing with your communities. And, you know, I think we're in a context where the government wants to help. Industry is certainly doing lots of things. What do you think is important that the government can do to support social innovation in your communities? The federal government's talking about a benefit sharing framework. Alberta has their Indigenous Opportunities program. What's needed? How do we get more of the good things that you're seeing in your work? And maybe either of you can jump in first.
I can start with a couple of things. I think one big piece for Indigenous communities across Canada is the whole idea of access to capital. I think that, you know, if we're wanting to promote and encourage First Nations to have equity ownership and the buy-in and the opportunity to do that, then we need to be able to provide the access of capital to do that. I think that's really important. I think that more and more we're seeing economic development, each nation building their own economy within their own communities. I think we're seeing more and more of that. And I think that a lot of nations, you know, want to be sovereign, but I think that's piece that sort of holds us back from doing that. I think that the other piece that the government can look at is not only for Indigenous people, but I think for the whole country itself is looking at those whole caps that they put on greenhouse gas emissions. And I think we need to, you know, like Chris said, think globally. You know, the whole idea from the Glasgow outcomes of Canada supporting Asia to getting off of coal, I think that's still an important message. It's still relevant today. And I think that when we look at things globally and being able to reduce that greenhouse gas emission footprint globally, I think that we're going to make more inroads by doing that. And I think that's where Canada needs to think big, not only for Canada's footprint, but for the globe's footprint. And I think that's one of the biggest messages that we need to, you know, continue to bring that message home. And then I'm probably going to veer off a little bit here, but I think that whole conversation about the Ukraine, I think that's in the forefront. We're seeing the demand for LNG in Europe. And some of my colleagues have talked to some ambassadors about that, and I think that's they're saying, how fast can we get our natural gas to the European countries? And I think that's the message that we need to need to bring forward. And Indigenous people are a part of that conversation. Indigenous people across Canada, you see these as beneficial projects, not only for the Indigenous communities, but for Canada as a whole. So I think those are probably the bigger picture items that we need to be looking at.
Chris, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, look, I echo Karen's response. Access to capital is the number one deterrent for Indigenous communities, but also I think it would be important if the government would help fund dialogue at these tables, because it's not cheap to get to. Most of our communities are remote, and a lot of them are paying out of their own pocket to get to and from to make sure these important conversations continue to happen. I think it's important to also note that we need to start growing our own timber. And that's really essentially what our tables in our communities are trying to do. When you grow your own timber, you plan for the next 7 generations. So we need to look at this as a perspective of looking at Head Start. And when they're coming up the chain, going into to junior high or middle school and then into junior high, I think we need to be able to capture that audience, our future leaders at that stage is when you start to understand or have an idea of what you want to do in your young career. Europe has a phenomenal model where they look at the trades as soon as you hit grade 8. So those are all those things that the leaders take into consideration, as well as they talk about now the global issues that are happening today. They talk a lot about Ukraine and the unfortunate circumstances that has happened over there. And then, of course, the impact to Europe, the supply for oil and gas impacting everyday people in that country. And, their electrical bills are through the roof right now. And when you don't have enough production, well, the result is inflation. I think Canada has a fantastic opportunity to not only grow our own timber in our own backyards, but collectively as a nation, as Canadians, we have an opportunity to be a power play with Indigenous-led initiatives that can help benefit all these other countries that do have a high output of emissions, like Asia and all these other places that are building coal-fired plants in China. So I think it's important, and I really believe it's indicative that we move forward and start to realize that we are a major player on the global scale. And if I think back to a couple of months ago, if you recall, the International Energy Agency touted that Canada has the best and most ethical and cleanest energy or oil and gas that could be provided to the rest of the world. We have to be able to listen to that. And I really believe that the path forward on this is Indigenous-led initiatives by partnering with industry and also looking after our neighbors. As Karen alluded to, we've always wanted to, as a people, take everybody along, but we also have to look at our neighbors. Indigenous or not, we have to work collectively as a group and move forward with the same vision in mind that Canada in itself could be an independent nation and a big player in the energy world.
Absolutely. I think this segues nicely into well, we can play this big role in the world. We have upstream gas here. We were having a big conversation about LNG in Canada. What do you think are some of the exciting opportunities for Canada in the natural gas space? And what else do you think is on the horizon from that perspective that you're excited about?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, I'm talking to you, Chris.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Well, listen, we're going to have an opportunity to access Southeast Asia's markets. Prince Rupert is destined to be the home of the low carbon port. We have access. We're quicker to the Asia Pacific, between 10 and 14 days. We're the fastest growing port on the North American seaboard. I've always said to our people that this is the area that the country needs to focus on. is the coast, south and north, because we do. The reality is we are better situated when you talk about logistics and international access to proper infrastructure development in Canada, which currently right now we lack. If we could focus on the opportunity to develop our infrastructure through the corridor, Canada could be in a very, very powerful position with Indigenous-led projects. I always say, look, this is an opportunity for our communities and our people to be a global player. And I'll keep repeating it: think globally and act locally. We've always been a people that wants to take care of the environment and grow the economy. Well, this is now the opportunity to do so. But on the other side of that is that, and I always say this, and I think you guys have heard me say this multiple times, I'll be the first to advocate for Indigenous sovereignty. I will fight for our culture. However, we have limitations, and there's a thing called market and market access, and it doesn't wait for anybody. It's not biased to any one country. And when the gates open, and whoever's across the finish line first is the one who's going to get to the market first. So we can either be a part of this opportunity, which I'm hopeful that this is where we're headed, or we're going to watch the boat go by again. So we got to be able to make these decisions. I know we're a patient people, but at the same time, we got to be very aware of how the market works. And like I said, the market waits for no one, and we need to be prepared for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Karen, thoughts on that?
I think just to maybe touch a little bit on the East Coast, I think that there's a huge opportunity, a huge demand for the East Coast First Nations and the provinces there to sort of jump on this whole demand to the European countries. I think that's probably the biggest piece that we're dealing with now. It's in the news. We're seeing a lot of different news clips about it. I think that we're in a position to help. And I think Canada really needs to open our eyes and our ears and say, yes, we're here, we want to help. And I think that, if it's going to help countries get off of coal, which is more, harmful for the environment, if we can bring those greenhouse gas emissions down, then we're doing our jobs, not only as Indigenous people, but as a country. And I think that it would be wise for Canada to sort of find ways to get onto this opportunity for the Ukraine to help their country while they're in crisis, and to help other European countries as well. I think we need to do our part. And I think that's what I see in the forefront, especially dealing with the Ukraine. We have a huge opportunity here. And I think we need to jump on it. Like Chris said, if we don't, we're going to miss that boat. And, it's not going to be a win-win for Canada, for Indigenous people, for the provinces, and for the European countries. So we really need to get it right, and do it right, and just move forward quickly.
All right. Call to action. I want to just let the audience know I have a few more questions, and then we were going to be turning it over to audience questions. So please feel free to add your questions to our panelists in the chat. I think an important theme that's come out in this conversation has been the whole notion of reconciliation between Indigenous communities. Today I read a Toronto Star article from JP Gladue, formerly of the Aboriginal Business Council, now kind of at large in the business world as an Indigenous leader, just talking about all of the opinions about what Indigenous people think about development. And so, one of the questions that we received before this panel was, well, how do we learn from the work Indigenous people are doing in order to reduce polarization in Canada around resource development? And I'd welcome, hearing from either of you about, how do we do this work? How do we deal with the misperceptions that are out there? And maybe I'll start with you, Chris.
Well, first, I'm just as frustrated that the fact that mainstream media doesn't pick up on that the vast majority of Indigenous people in Canada are in favor of responsible resource development. It kind of got away from us over the last 15 to 20 years, unfortunately. But the reality is the lack of production in the resource sector is actually hurting our communities. We are the ones that are suffering the most for the lack of opportunity in the natural resource sector, and not just in oil and gas, but in fisheries and forestry. We were talking about this yesterday, and Karen, I saw the same video where the Pachida respectfully went in on their own territory with Dididat to ask the protesters to respectfully leave. They brought their high chief of the community, and they kept their cool. They were calm. They were collective. They showed an immense amount of class, and asked the outsiders to respectfully leave their territory. And we all saw the end result of that video, and they were completely ignored. And as an Indigenous person in Canada, I was so proud and so full of pride watching them go through their protocol, only to be disrespected by these protesters, basically saying, we've allowed you to come negotiate with us on your own territory. We've allowed you to come here. And as an Indigenous person in Canada, any Indigenous person in Canada that has watched that video should be outraged and incensed, because what if that was you? What if that was your uncle or your grandfather or your nephew who was completely disrespected by a group of people that have no regard for our not only our protocols, but if we have internal differences, the only people that will resolve those differences is us, not an outsider trying to send messages in so that they may influence one or two members. That's not how this is going to work. So I really see the tides changing here. I mean, it was an unbelievable video. I commend those leaders, both hereditary and elected, to doing what they needed to do. But the misconception out there that somehow we're all against development is simply not true. We are in favor of responsible resource development. And then one of the other things that come up, well, what do we do with individuals that oppose these development projects? Well, you also have to hear them out. At the end of the day, there's a thing called democracy. And, we have to make a decision. And I always say that let's make the best decision with the best available information that has been provided to us, just like everything we do in our daily lives, from running our homes, from feeding our kids, to making sure they get a good education, to making sure they're safe. It's the same process, just on a bigger scale. So we need to be able to be rational. We need to be able to sit across from one another, where we could have proper, constructive, and respectful dialogue without screaming at one another. Because at the end of the day, whether you were for or against or indifferent, we all want the same thing. How do we grow the economy while we take care of the environment?
Right on. Karen, your thoughts?
I think, like Chris said, I can't emphasize that enough. What we've seen with, it's a classic example of how, First Nations communities can work together. We see that they work together for the collective. The responsibility of the chiefs, the head chiefs, is for the people and the land. And it's the same sort of responsibility that you find with elected councils. When you see nations working together for their communities, that's where we want to be at. Because, it's all of our responsibility within our communities to be looking after the people and the land. And I think that we do them, they're both important, they're both critical to us. So that to me was sovereignty in action. A sovereign nation, they know what they want and how they're going to get it. They want to build their economy within their communities in this modern day context, using their Indigenous principles. I think that's really key, because at the end of the day, we all have a responsibility as leadership within our communities to look after our people and to look after the environment. And we can't emphasize that enough. I think it's, when we have those two pieces together, I think we have a good ingredients for major projects going through and by our territories and communities. I think so many benefits can come from it, and I think and the benefits go back to the community. That's a critical question all leadership should be asking themselves. Is what I'm doing benefiting our people? That's the critical question that, depending on what kind of leadership you're in, that's what we should be asking ourselves. Who is benefiting and why?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Karen. So we have a couple questions from our participants. And maybe I'll start with this one because I think it kind of builds nicely on what you've both been talking about, which is, addressing these issues within communities, between communities. So the question is, how can independent nations gain alignment or unity on approaches to major projects or economic development within areas that are being contested? So I don't know, maybe we'll start with you, Karen, to mix it up a bit. But what do you think is important for building alignment and unity among kind of nations that are independent and might have different interests?
I think Chris sort of touched on this. I think it's about sitting down and having those important and hard discussions, because not everybody in our communities agree. There are people that are for, against, or like you said, and indifferent. And, when we look at major projects and we think of our people, like, we have to keep our principles and our values in the forefront and on the side of us so that they're there when we're making these decisions. All of these principles that we value in our communities, we have to sort of filter all of our decisions through those values. And I think that's important for us. I can't emphasize enough as well that having those hard discussions, having those discussions internally with your own people, I think that's where we need to be at, and continuously hash out our differences. And that's really what needs to happen in some communities. Like Chris said, when a community works together and has a solid foundation, what a powerhouse that community can be. The nations on the island just showcased that for us. They had the hereditary and the elected system working together in unison, having the same voice, because at the end of the day, we're still clan members, we're still members, and we still want to see our people move forward and see our nations move forward. So I think it's sitting down and having those hard discussions.
Anything to add, Chris?
No, I mean, just a couple comments. I mean, Karen hit it right on the button. I think, look, at the end of the day, the only way we are going to solve these challenges is having these very difficult conversations. That's how you get to the other side and move forward together. The other thing is I encourage our communities not to be afraid to talk about money. There's this whole notion out there that somehow money's bad. Well, first of all, money is what helps us build critical infrastructure. It helps us with our arts, language, and culture. It helps put our kids to school. It helps take care of our elders. It helps our members get out into the ocean on their boats, which needs fuel. It helps so many things and aspects. So I always encourage our people, don't ever be afraid to talk about money. Money is not everything, but when you have it, it certainly could do many things for your family, as we clearly see the change that it has made in our communities. I talked to so many of our members, they're investing in bonds, they're investing in markets, they're putting together a nest egg for their kids. I've never even talked about that as a child or even as a young adult in my early 20s. And so you could see the change. And the other thing is a little bit of a story. I have dealt with the investment group out of New York. And it's funny listening to hear these guys from Wall Street talk about a band council resolution. And so when you hear that, things really changed all over the world. And so when they know more about the process than many people I've dealt with, people outside of Canada are paying close attention to Indigenous-led projects.
Yep, and that's good. The world's a-changing.
It's a good sign.
So one of the questions we got, and I think this speaks to that opportunity to support Europe, is how do we solve the lack of gas supply to the east coast of Canada? What's going to be important in getting the infrastructure out there to make that happen, to play that role? Chris, why don't you start?
Well, you have to have buy-in in order for that to happen. Right now it's been a real challenge at the federal level and at the provincial level. So they have to be able to have an open mind. And as Karen alluded to around some of these policies, Canada's LNG is the cleanest in the world, and I'll keep saying that. We have the highest environmental standards. We have the highest ethical standards. We have the human rights factor that's the highest in the world. And we care about our people. We care about Canadians. So you have to have buy-in and open mind that collectively, as the nations move forward to look at these projects, both whether it's east or west or south, that the government needs to be at the table wanting to play ball. We can't have these mixed messages that is going on out there, because I know there are members of parliament and people that do support Indigenous sovereignty. But when we have government making these statements publicly when it comes to policy around the environment, there's mixed messaging that's getting out even to the activists. And so when they see projects like Cedar move forward and other projects move forward, that's the reason why these activists are kind of losing their minds, because the messaging that's coming out of Ottawa, and even the province for that matter, is very contradictory in terms of what they say in the public eye. So all I ask is that, look, let's be honest and open and transparent about the discussions. You support Indigenous sovereignty, you support independence to get our own energy out to market. And what way to solve that crisis right now than to partner with Indigenous communities, east or west, to get into the European markets, which Europe desperately needs, and then Southeast Asia and Asia in general, it desperately needs to get off coal. So we're in a prime position, Canada, to access both markets. It's critical.
Yeah. Getting more to market. Karen, anything to add?
I can't agree with Chris more. Like the comments that he made, like we need to continue to emphasize them. The think globally and act globally. I like that phrase, because that's where we need to be at. And we can't emphasize enough that all of us need to be on the same page. The federal government, the provincial governments, the Indigenous governments, and industry. We all need to be on the same page, giving the same message and making sure that, we want to, make our way to Europe. And I think that's really important. We've said it before, we'll continue to say it. We all need to have that same messaging going out, moving forward.
So as a last question, because I know we're kind of getting towards the time, one of the questions from the audience is, what steps, education, engagement, or immersion can individuals take to embrace First Nations culture? And I guess I would add cultures. So how do people go about learning more and getting more involved? So they're not just reading the newspaper to understand what's going on and how communities feel. Karen, why don't you start?
Well, I think that there's a book that that just recently was published. It was about the two worlds, that was written by Michael McPhee and Christy Smith, and they talk about like how to engage with Indigenous communities. It talks about economic reconciliation and reconciliation. And I think Canada, we have quite a diversity with Indigenous communities. We have different language families, so we're all diverse. We have different ways that we, embrace our culture, and I think that it's up to each one of us to learn about them and not think that we're all the same. What we do here in BC is different from what we do in the East Coast. It's about getting involved in the communities. Attending the functions, because here in the West Coast, a lot of our nations on the coastal and some interior, we practice in the feast hall. So, there's different ceremonies that nations have. It's very diverse all across Canada. In BC here, according to the Indian Act, we have 634 nations across Canada, and we have 200 of them in BC alone. So when you think about major projects, you can't get through BC without bumping into an Indigenous community. So you gotta, you know, embrace us because we're here. We're here to stay and just get involved with communities, get involved with the leadership. You know, there's a lot of cultural events that happen, and I think just learn about it because, you know, even as an Indigenous person, I still continue to learn about our own people across Canada. So I think it's something that we all need to embrace.
All right, Chris?
Look, Karen couldn't have said it any better. You know, there's over 200 different dialects right here in British Columbia. And so just to get to know who we are, don't put us under one umbrella. We all have different points of view. Everybody has a different opinion, but know that not all Indigenous people are against resource development. I just think it's important to get to know. And if you're unsure, I always tell people, never be afraid to ask. People are afraid to engage in some of these sensitive topics when it comes to reconciliation or the residential school. If you don't know what you don't know. So I mean, I'm ignorant to things that I'm not aware of. And like Karen had mentioned, I'm also still learning a lot about our own cultures here in Canada because they're so vast and so broad. It's incredible what Canada has in terms of diversity when it comes to not just Indigenous people, but all people in this country. So just, yeah, I couldn't have said it any better, Karen. Like you couldn't have said it any better. So thank you for that.
All right. Well, thanks to you both. And I have a comment here in the chat box which got thumbs up. It says Wigas or respect to presenters today. Thank you for your open conversations. I think there's a lot of appreciation in our audience, and I'm sure as we kind of share this online, there'll be even more. So very grateful for your comments today and your experience being shared with our folks today. And I'll thank you, and thanks to CJ for this opportunity. And I'll turn it back over to Julie.
Thank you, Shannon. So it is already time to conclude. I want to thank all the participants for taking 1 hour in your busy schedule to be with us today. We'd also like to thank Shannon for agreeing to moderate this webinar and our two panelists, Karen and Chris. I repeat that very often, but it is true. You really inspired us, so please continue to do that. It was a great discussion. Thank you for your participation. And in conclusion, we should remind ourselves that the role that Canada as an energy exporter can play to enable global energy security, global emissions reduction, while advancing reconciliation and the prosperity of Indigenous communities. We hope you will join us again for our next webinar at the end of the summer. Stay tuned for the details. Have a great day and enjoy your summer. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.